You brought your mistress into my home wearing my jewelry. On the third betrayal, half the empire you claim to have built alone goes to me." When Henry Vance opened the envelope in the middle of the ballroom illuminated by Italian chandeliers, he was still smiling as if the entire world belonged to him. His wife stood before him, serene, wearing the navy blue dress he always said was far too simple for high society galas. Beside him, Chloe Davies displayed a sapphire necklace on her neck that did not belong to her. Marianne recognized every single stone. She also recognized the delicate chain, the slightly crooked clasp, the tiny mark on the back of the pendant. It was the gift Henry had given her on their 10th wedding anniversary, when he swore no other woman would ever take her place. "You brought your mistress into my home wearing my jewelry," Marianne said, without raising her voice. The ballroom fell dead silent. Investors, relatives, photographers, and staff stopped moving, as if someone had pulled the plug on the music. Henry turned pale but tried to force a laugh. Estelle, his mother, pressed her lips together in pure disdain. Chloe's hand flew to the necklace. It was too late. "Mary, I came to collect." Henry pulled the pages from the envelope. On the very first page, in cold and flawless print, the header read, "Divorce settlement, asset division, and recognition of corporate equity." For the first time in 15 years, the man who had built an empire with absolute certainty realized he did not know the woman who slept beside him. Marianne Atwood met Henry Vance long before business magazines dubbed him the Skyline King. Back then, he still wore cheap suits, carried architectural models in the back seat of a finance sedan, and spent entire nights crunching numbers at a kitchen table that creaked under the sheer weight of his dreams. Marianne had not fallen in love with his money, because there was no money. She had fallen in love with the restless spark in his eyes, with his almost reckless courage, with the way Henry spoke of buildings, neighborhoods, and avenues as if he could redraw the city with his bare hands. She came from a discreet but highly respected family. Her father, Arthur Atwood, had owned a small real estate development firm in Pennsylvania, known for its unwavering honesty and for never, not once, delaying a single construction worker's paycheck. When her father died, Marianne inherited equity, a highly valued plot of land, and a sum of money that, while not making her a multimillionaire, represented decades of clean, hard work. Henry told her that such a legacy should not just sit in a bank account. "Your father believed in building, Marianne. Let me honor that." She believed him. She signed papers, invested everything she had, supported him through grueling meetings, and during those early years, she heard him say countless times, "This empire is ours." Time, however, has a silent way of shifting pronouns. First, the newspapers started calling Vance Holdings his company. Then, the board members referred to the skyscrapers as his achievements. Soon after, Henry began to subtly correct anyone who mentioned that Marianne had also been a crucial part of the beginning. "She supported me a lot," he would say with a polite smile, as if her support were merely a cheerleader's cheer, not a legally binding signature. Marianne chose not to notice, believing that every marriage required certain sacrifices. She managed their lavish estate, proofread his speeches, hosted the wives of board directors, and even diffused internal corporate crises before they could reach her husband's executive suite. In public, Henry called her his rock. In private, he was already beginning to treat her like an antique piece of furniture, useful and expensive, but merely part of the background scenery. The first crack appeared on a gala night in Manhattan. Vance Holdings had just won a billion-dollar bid for a luxury residential complex, and Henry had insisted Marianne wear a champagne-colored dress bought in Paris. "Everyone is going to be looking at us tonight," he said, adjusting his tie in the mirror. Marianne smiled, but noticed he was only looking at his own reflection. The party occupied the penthouse floor of a hotel overlooking the city. Glasses clinked, camera flashes blinded the room, and Henry navigated the tables with the swagger of a man entirely accustomed to being desired. Marianne stayed close, playing the role she had learned to perfect, smiling without exaggeration, speaking little, looking exactly happy enough so as not to steal her husband's spotlight. That was when she saw Brianna Sterling, a young architect hired 6 months prior, touch Henry's arm with entirely too much intimacy. It was not the touch that shattered Marianne. It was the way Henry looked at Brianna. It was not the polite gaze offered to an employee, nor the distracted look of a man surrounded by a crowd. It was a look Marianne knew intimately. It was a look that had once belonged solely to her. Later, when Henry claimed he needed to take an urgent phone call, Marianne felt a cold unease creep up the back of her neck. She waited a few minutes, then walked down the venue's side corridor. The thick carpets muffled her footsteps. As she turned near the service elevator, she heard a low laugh. Henry was leaning against the wall, his hands on Brianna's waist, his mouth entirely too close to hers. Brianna was the first to see Marianne. The color drained from her face. Henry pulled away with a flinch so violent it looked ridiculous. "Marianne, it's not what you think." Marianne found that tiny sentence incredibly cruel in the face of such massive pain. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply looked at him like someone trying to recognize a human being behind a mask. "Then tell me what it is," she replied. Henry opened his mouth but could not find a lie good enough. Brianna muttered an apology and scurried away, leaving behind a sweet perfume that Marianne would spend months despising. Henry grabbed his wife's arm. "It was a mistake. A stupid moment. I had a few drinks. I've been under so much pressure. This bid made me lose my mind. Marianne, please look at me. You know who I am." That night, she discovered that the phrase "you know who I am" can sound either like a plea for trust or a disguised threat. Henry cried in the back of the town car. He cried at home. He fell to his knees beside their bed and swore nothing had happened beyond a kiss. He said the company's stock depended on their stability, that his mother would have a heart attack, that the tabloids would destroy everything if the news leaked. He also said he loved her, and Marianne wanted it to be true so badly that she clung to that word the way a person trapped in a fire clings to an open window. She forgave him. Brianna was transferred to another project and left the company months later. Henry spent a few weeks coming home early, bringing expensive flowers. Marianne tried to rebuild her trust with the delicate touch of someone gluing broken porcelain back together. On the outside, the vase regains its shape. On the inside, every crack remembers exactly where it started. What Marianne never told anyone was that on that very same night, while taking off Henry's suit jacket, she found a receipt from a high-end jeweler in his inner pocket. He had purchased a sapphire necklace, but he had never given it to her. When she casually asked about it days later, he claimed it was a corporate gift for an important client. Marianne kept the receipt inside an old lockbox, right next to her father's letters and her inheritance documents. She did not yet know why. Perhaps because some pains require witnesses, even mute ones. In the following years, Vance Holdings grew like a starving organism. It bought up land, swallowed competitors, and erected towers that permanently altered the skylines of several major cities. Henry appeared on magazine covers, gave interviews about strategic vision, and repeated the myth that he had started with nothing but grit. Marianne would sit beside him during these interviews, her hands folded in her lap, feeling her father's memory being shoved into a dark corner. One evening, after a televised interview, she carefully suggested, "You could mention that the first plot of land came from my family, not for my sake, but for my father's." Henry took off his watch, looking exhausted. "Marianne, the public loves a simple narrative. The self-made man who started at the bottom, worked hard, and won. If I start explaining inheritances, equity stakes, and family backing, it turns into a completely different story. But it's the true story." He looked at her through the mirror with clear impatience. The truth has to be marketable too. That was the first time Marianne felt genuine fear. Not of a romantic betrayal, but of something much darker. Henry did not just lie to hide sins. He edited reality until everyone believed the version that favored him the most. And if he could do that with the very origin of his empire, perhaps he could do it with anything. Even with her. Still, Marianne stayed. Love, when mixed with years of habit, gratitude, and fear, turns iron chains into bracelets. She told herself that strong marriages weather terrible storms. She told herself that a man had flaws, but he wasn't a monster. She told herself that an intelligent woman does not throw away a lifetime over a moment of masculine weakness. She repeated so many of these phrases that she almost managed to confuse them with wisdom, until the second betrayal arrived. It did not come as a storm, but as a silent, constant leak, rotting the walls from the inside out. Chloe Davies joined Vance Holdings with a brilliant resume and an ambition she made absolutely no effort to hide. She was a marketing consultant who spoke with immense confidence in board meetings and knew exactly how to praise Henry in the perfect tone, inflating his ego just enough without sounding like a cheap sycophant. Estelle, Henry's mother, adored her from their very first lunch. Such a modern, decisive young woman with real presence, Estelle commented while Marianne served coffee to the guests at their Hamptons estate. It was not an innocent compliment. Estelle never said a word without carefully selecting who should bleed from the sentence. Henry's mother had always treated Marianne with a sharp, cutting cordiality. Early in the marriage, she had accepted her daughter-in-law because the Atwood family had a spotless reputation and some solid wealth. Later, when Henry became a billionaire, Estelle began to act as if Marianne had been a necessary stepping stone that had outlived its usefulness. To Estelle, the ideal wife was not the one who helped pour the concrete, but the one who elevated her son's social brilliance. Marianne, modest and reserved, no longer fit the glittering new ballrooms Estelle wished to conquer. Chloe quickly noticed she was Estelle's favorite. She praised the older woman's jewelry, laughed at old family anecdotes, and called Henry a visionary right in front of key investors. Marianne simply watched. After the first betrayal, she had learned that the warning signs never start in the bedroom. They start at the dinner table, in lingering glances, in exaggerated defenses, in a familiarity that blooms long before it has any right to exist. The ultimate confirmation came on a rainy Sunday morning. Henry had forgotten his personal phone in the walk-in closet. Marianne did not snoop through his things. She never had, but the device buzzed repeatedly on the mahogany island, illuminating the screen with a text message that required no passcode to draw blood. "Can you escape her again today? I still have your scent in my hair." The contact name was saved as C. Marketing. Marianne stood entirely still. The sound of the rain lashing against the windows seemed to amplify inside her skull. When Henry rushed back into the closet, he found her holding the phone. "Who is she?" Marianne asked. He looked at the glowing screen, then at his wife. For a split second, there was no apology, only sheer irritation at having been caught. "Are you invading my privacy?" Marianne let out a joyless laugh. "Your privacy is calling me her." Henry ran a hand through his hair, exasperated. Unlike the first time, he did not fall to his knees. He did not cry. He sat down on the velvet armchair, like a CEO analyzing a breach of contract. "It's been a confusing situation. Chloe was there for me during a really tough quarter. You've been so distant lately, Marianne. Always so serious, always judging me, always looking at me like I owe you something." Guilt, Marianne realized, was just a piece of furniture Henry rearranged to suit his convenience. Before, he had cheated because of work pressure. Now, he was cheating because she was too cold. Perhaps next time he would claim he cheated to save the American economy. "How long?" she asked. Henry looked away. "That doesn't help." "How long?" "A few months." Marianne knew it was a lie. A few months is the exact measurement guilty men use when they need to hide years. She could have walked out that very day. She had money. Less than she deserved. But she had it. She had her pride. It was deeply wounded, but not dead. Yet there was something she had learned that went far beyond love. It was the terrifying certainty that leaving at that exact moment would mean leaving Henry completely whole, powerful, and in absolute control of the narrative. He would tell everyone his wife had gone crazy with jealousy. Estelle would tell society Marianne was never up to the task. Chloe would inevitably take over her house, her dining table, and her history, acting as if it had all been built just for her. So, Marianne did something that surprised even herself. She did not smash the phone. She did not kick Henry out. She did not hunt down Chloe. She simply placed the device back on the mahogany wood and said, "I want the entire truth, and I want her out of the company." Henry, visibly relieved at not facing an immediate public scandal, promised to do whatever was necessary. He said he would end it immediately. He claimed Chloe was a talented asset but could easily be reassigned to a different state. He swore he loved Marianne in a mature, profound way, completely separate from these stupid, fleeting passions. Marianne listened to every single word like an audience member watching a play, knowing full well the actors would forget their lines by the very next scene. Chloe was not fired. She was promoted. The justification was delivered during an emergency board meeting. According to Henry, the Vance Holdings rebranding campaign required someone with a bold, aggressive vision. Chloe was to take over as the director of corporate image. Marianne found out through the Wall Street Journal, not from her husband. The published photograph showed Henry and Chloe standing shoulder to shoulder, smiling brightly under the headline, "Vance Holdings Bets on Young, Strategic Female Leadership for New Era." Marianne zoomed in on the image on her tablet and noticed Chloe's hand resting entirely too close to Henry's arm. That night, during a formal family dinner at the estate, Estelle made a pointed remark in front of several cousins. Some women instinctively understand the fast-paced rhythm of a great man. Others just get stuck in the past, obsessing over window treatments and expecting eternal gratitude. Marianne placed her silver fork quietly down on her porcelain plate. Henry kept chewing his steak, pretending he hadn't heard a thing. "Are you speaking to me, Estelle?" Marianne asked. Estelle offered a saccharine smile. "Oh, don't be silly, dear. I'm simply making observations about life." Chloe, who had been invited as a corporate consultant, cast her eyes downward to hide a smug smile. It was a minuscule gesture, almost invisible, but Marianne logged it away, just as she had logged away receipts, dates, sentences, and long silences. After the dinner guests left, Henry accused her of creating unnecessary tension. "You know how my mother is. You have to stop taking offense to every little thing. Your mistress was sitting at our dining table. She is a corporate director now. Why did you put her there?" Henry stepped closer, his voice dropping to a hard, low register. "Careful, Marianne. You are confusing your emotional pain with the right to interfere in my company." That sentence pierced something incredibly deep. His company. As if she had never sold her father's land to fund it. As if she had never signed away her personal guarantees when no bank on Wall Street would trust Henry Vance. As if she had never spent grueling nights reviewing financial spreadsheets while he slept exhausted on the sofa with his head in her lap. "The right," Marianne repeated softly. "You know what I meant," but she knew exactly what he meant. For the first time, Henry was not just betraying her body. He was actively erasing her history. The second pardon happened without a single embrace. Marianne simply stated she would not file for divorce. In that moment, Henry interpreted her staying as a total victory. Estelle interpreted it as pathetic weakness. Chloe interpreted it as an open invitation to advance. None of them realized that Marianne had fundamentally changed. The first forgiveness was born out of love. The second was born out of a desperate need for time. In the following months, she began attending fewer charity galas and spending more time in dusty archives. She reopened old lockboxes, hunted down her father's original deeds, and cross-referenced dates. She made quiet phone calls to retired employees, inviting them out for coffee. She listened to stories that confirmed her darkest suspicions. She discovered that legal contracts she had signed had been quietly altered afterward. She discovered that her equity in the founding LLCs had been severely diluted through financial maneuvers Henry casually referred to as corporate restructuring. She discovered that the prime land she inherited from Arthur Atwood now appeared in annual reports as a strategic early acquisition by Henry Vance. Every new discovery stung, but it also sparked a brilliant, icy lucidity. Marianne finally understood that her life hadn't been stolen in one dramatic, cinematic heist. It had been stolen through 1,000 tiny concessions. A document signed without reading because she trusted her husband. A magazine interview where she chose to stay quiet. A board meeting where she let Henry speak for them both. A swallowed humiliation just to keep the peace in the family. One afternoon, she met with Claire Norton, an old college roommate who had become one of the most ruthless and respected corporate and family law attorneys on the East Coast. They sat in an unassuming coffee shop in Brooklyn, far away from the zip codes Marianne usually frequented. Marianne brought a plain leather folder, devoid of any designer logos. Claire flipped through the first stack of papers, and her expression darkened. "Marianne, do you fully understand what you have here?" "Not completely yet." "Then I'll be blunt. This isn't just grounds for a messy divorce. This is deliberate concealment of marital assets, potential corporate fraud, and unauthorized use of a signature. If you want to go to war, you need to stop begging for his respect and start demanding hard proof." Marianne looked out the cafe window. A fine, dirty rain was falling over the city, looking exactly like that Sunday morning when she found the phone. But this time the water wasn't leaking through the cracks. It was washing away the grime. "I don't want to destroy him out of revenge," she said softly. Claire closed the folder with a snap. "Then destroy him out of justice." That night, Henry came home late, smelling faintly of a designer fragrance that did not belong to him. Marianne pretended to be asleep. She felt the expensive mattress sink beside her, listening to the steady breathing of a man entirely convinced he had gotten away with it again. She kept her eyes shut, and for the first time in years, she did not shed a single tear. Deep inside her, something cold and silent was signing a binding contract with the future. Claire did not allow Marianne to turn her agony into impatience. Men like Henry rely entirely on the emotional explosions of the women they hurt, the lawyer explained during their first official strategy meeting. If you yell, he'll call you hysterical. If you cry, he'll call you fragile. If you threaten him without having the loaded gun in your hand, he'll hide the money offshore before you even reach the front door. Marianne listened in silence, gripping a teacup until it went cold in her hands. Learning to wait, after having waited for him her entire life, felt like an exquisite form of cruelty. But there was a vast difference between simply enduring and actively preparing. Over the next few weeks, Marianne began living two separate lives. On the surface, she remained the elegant, compliant wife who accompanied Henry to Gallus, smiled perfectly for the paparazzi, and replied to relatives' text messages with perfectly neutral emojis. Beneath the surface, she was painstakingly reconstructing the true history of the Vance empire. Claire assembled a small, fiercely discreet strike team, a forensic accountant named Vince Carter, a paralegal, and an expert in corporate equity law. No one ever used Marianne's name over the phone. Every move was executed with surgical precision. The first massive piece of leverage emerged from the lockbox Marianne had kept since her father's passing. Nestled between yellowed letters and photographs of Arthur Atwood wearing a hard hat on modest construction sites was the original land transfer deed that had seeded Henry's very first major development. The document clearly proved Marianne hadn't just supported her husband. She had legally transferred a highly valuable asset into their initial joint venture in direct exchange for a proportional equity stake in all future expansions of the group. Vince, the accountant, read the contract 3 times. "This right here is the seed that grew the entire forest," he murmured. Marianne felt a heavy pressure in her chest. For years, she had listened to Henry boast that he had started with absolutely nothing. Now, sitting right in front of her, was undeniable proof that nothing had a first name, a last name, and a legal signature. Arthur Atwood, represented by his daughter. Next came the corporate meeting minutes. Some original copies were buried in dusty county clerk offices, entirely forgotten because Henry arrogantly believed no one would ever dig that deep. Others had to be requested via quiet legal subpoenas. Claire cross-referenced the timelines and found glaring, bizarre alterations. During one specific shareholder meeting, Marianne's equity had been slashed under the guise of a capital increase she had never actually approved. In another file, a power of attorney bearing her signature authorized Henry to trade shares strictly in her name. Marianne recognized the signature, but not the document itself. "I signed a lot of blank forms when I still trusted him," she admitted quietly. "This power of attorney is dated right around the time you were hospitalized with severe pneumonia," Claire noted, her voice dangerously calm. Marianne went ice cold. She remembered that brutal winter. The spiking fever, the struggle to breathe, Henry walking into her private hospital room holding a bouquet of flowers and a stack of papers. "Just some bank formalities, honey," he had said soothingly. She had signed them using a lifestyle magazine as a clipboard. Maybe it was that day, maybe it wasn't. Corporate betrayal, unlike romantic betrayal, didn't leave cheap perfume on the pillowcases. It left notary stamps. While Marianne gathered the ammunition, Chloe maneuvered through the company like a queen in waiting. She began showing up at Sunday family brunches with an insulting level of entitlement. She selected the caterers for events held at the Hamptons estate, voiced her opinions on the company's philanthropic efforts, and even suggested remodeling the CEO's executive office. Henry pretended not to notice her overstepping because her overstepping fed his ego. Estelle, meanwhile, actively fueled the fire. "Henry needs a woman who can walk right alongside him in today's fast-paced world," Estelle remarked one afternoon, while Marianne was organizing tax files in the estate's study. Marianne slowly looked up. "And where exactly did I walk, Estelle? Behind him? You walked where you were needed at the time. But some people simply can't keep up with their own luck when it outgrows them." For a burning second, Marianne almost unleashed everything she had uncovered. She almost screamed about the land deeds, the forged signatures, the stolen equity. But she had learned the hard way that certain truths, when spoken a minute too soon, only serve as an early warning siren for the enemy. So, she simply closed the oak drawer and offered a placid smile. "Perhaps you're right. Perhaps I kept up a little too well." Estelle didn't understand the comment. She assumed her daughter-in-law was finally surrendering. The ultimate turning point came via a blocked phone call from Oliver Mills, the former chief financial officer who had been brutally fired from Vance Holdings 4 years prior. Marianne met him at a rundown diner in Queens, miles away from the Michelin-starred restaurants Henry frequented. Oliver had aged terribly. He had dark circles under his eyes and spoke while constantly checking the exits, like a man still terrified of his former boss. "I really didn't want to get involved in this," Oliver muttered. "I have a family to protect." "I had a family too," Marianne replied evenly. Oliver took a deep, shaky breath and slid a encrypted flash drive across the sticky table. "Henry ordered me to create shell LLCs to drain the assets from the original holding companies. Your stake was trapped in those original entities. I questioned the legality of it at the time. 2 weeks later, I was formally accused of leaking corporate secrets and terminated for cause. I've never been able to get a C-suite job since." Marianne picked up the flash drive as if it were glowing hot. "Why give this to me now?" Oliver stared at her wedding band. "Because your father was the only developer in this city who shook my hand when I was just a broke intern, and he told me that character was worth a hell of a lot more than a resume. I owed Arthur this much." Driving back to the estate, Marianne finally cried in the car. But it wasn't the shattered, desperate weeping of the first betrayal. It was an older, deeper mourning for the daughter who had allowed her father's proud legacy to be paved over by another man's name. When she pulled up to the mansion, she found Henry and Chloe laughing together in the manicured gardens near the infinity pool. They jumped apart far too quickly as she approached. Marianne walked right past them without altering her pace. "You're home early," Henry called out. And you're still entirely predictable, she replied without looking back. Chloe frowned, unnerved not by the words but by the chilling calm in Marianne's voice. People who are deeply accustomed to humiliating others often confuse serenity with a lethal threat when their victim suddenly stops demanding explanations. That night, Claire opened the encrypted files on the flash drive. There were hidden spreadsheets, internal memos, and damning emails. In one specific thread, Henry had written to Oliver, "She doesn't understand corporate structuring and she trusts me. Just handle it." In another, he explicitly mentioned the legal risk of the Atwood heirs tracking the origin of the initial capital injections. Claire sat in absolute silence for a long time. Marianne, this changes the entire board. How much can I legally demand? Legally, an absolute fortune. Strategically, taking half might just be the opening counteroffer. Marianne didn't smile. The word half did not feel like greed to her. It felt like the bare minimum measurement of restitution. She didn't want the mansions, the sports cars, or the jewels out of sheer vanity. She wanted to force Henry Vance to look the world in the eye and admit that the empire towering under his name was built on her foundation. More than the billions, she wanted to rip his fake narrative to shreds. Claire began drafting the divorce settlement. It would not be a standard, polite document filled with lukewarm legal jargon about irreconcilable differences. It was going to be a declaration of total war dressed up as a civil contract. It demanded the ruthless division of assets, the legal recognition of her initial capital, the immediate restoration of her corporate equity, massive financial damages for asset concealment, and ironclad exposure clauses in case Henry attempted to move a single dime. Every single page was drafted with a clinical coldness that Marianne couldn't actually feel, but desperately needed to wield. Meanwhile, Chloe was relentlessly pressuring Henry. "How much longer are you going to keep up this pathetic charade?" she demanded one evening in the luxury Tribeca loft he had quietly rented under a shell company. Henry loosened his silk tie, looking trapped. "It's not that simple, Chloe. It looks pretty simple to me. You file the papers, you keep me, and you publicly claim a woman who actually fits your lifestyle." He let out an exhausted laugh. "Do you think a marriage at this level is just about romance? Marianne is woven into everything. The houses, the charity galas, the Atwood Foundation, the family's public image." Chloe stepped closer, her voice turning venomous, "Then cut her out of everything." Henry kissed her to shut her up, but the sentence hung heavily in the air. Cut Marianne out of everything. He genuinely believed he had been doing exactly that, piece by piece, for years. He had no idea that while he was plotting her final erasure, she was quietly rebuilding the absolute master map of everything she owned. The final, perfect detail came from the jewelry store. While organizing her father's box, Marianne had pulled out the receipt for the sapphire necklace purchased during Brianna's era. Out of pure curiosity, she asked Claire to run a quiet check on the piece. They discovered that Henry had picked up the necklace from the vault months later and altered the recipient's name in the jeweler's database. The piece had sat in his private safe for years. Marianne didn't immediately grasp the significance, but she had Claire request a certified, notarized copy of the receipt anyway. "Tiny details sometimes blow open massive doors," Claire had said. That very week, Estelle announced a massive, opulent reception at the Hamptons estate for their top-tier international investors. It was meant to be a grand celebration of Vance Holdings' newest urban project, a campaign spearheaded entirely by Chloe's team. Marianne received the formal Guaya corporate email, as if she were a mere guest in her own home. Henry walked into the master closet while she was looking through her evening wear. "I need you to attend tonight without making a scene." Marianne ran her hand over the fabric of a navy blue dress. "Have I ever made a scene, Henry?" He hesitated. The question sounded simple, but it carried the crushing weight of 15 years of unbroken silence. "I just want a smooth, quiet night. Then you will have one." Henry exhaled, his shoulders dropping, foolishly believing he still controlled the stage. Marianne closed the closet door. The second he left the suite, she picked up her phone. "Claire, finalize the contract. I want everything printed and ready for the reception tonight." On the other end of the line, the ruthless lawyer asked, "Are you absolutely certain?" Marianne looked at her own reflection in the full-length mirror. For the first time in a decade, the woman staring back did not look abandoned. She looked lethal. "I am. He's already had 2 pardons. The third will be a signature." The Vance estate had never looked so spectacular. The landscaping crew had trimmed the massive hedges until not a single leaf dared to step out of line. High-end florists had blanketed the grand foyer with white and gold orchids, and waitstaff in crisp tuxedos glided through the ballroom carrying silver trays of champagne, catching the light of the massive Italian chandeliers. To the Wall Street elite in attendance, It was just another flawless victory lap for Henry Vance. To Marianne, every single detail tasted strange and metallic, as if she were touring a museum exhibit of a life she had already decided to burn to the ground. She descended the grand, sweeping staircase at exactly 8:15 p.m., wearing the navy blue dress she had chosen with distinct, calculated intention. There was zero excess, no plunging neckline, no blinding diamonds, absolutely no desperate attempt to compete with anyone in the room. Her elegance radiated entirely from her posture. In her small clutch, she carried only a tube of lipstick, a tissue, and a reduced-size copy of the contract. The massive original binder was with Claire, who would be arriving later under the guise of representing the Atwood Foundation, a detail Henry had never cared enough about to red flag at the door. Henry spotted her from the bottom of the stairs and smiled with palpable relief. He stepped forward, offering his arm exactly the way he did for the society photographers. "You look beautiful tonight," he whispered. "I know." He blinked, taken aback by her flat, icy tone. Marianne took his arm for a few brief seconds, just long enough for the foreign investors to register the perfect, bulletproof image. The American magnate and his flawlessly discreet wife, united in the face of yet another triumph. Then she smoothly unlinked her arm and stepped away. Chloe made her grand entrance shortly after. She was poured into a striking crimson gown, wearing it as if she demanded the right to be the absolute center of gravity in the room. She navigated the mansion with arrogant ease, greeting Japanese investors and legacy board members, being loudly introduced by Henry as the brilliant, visionary mind behind the new era of Vance Holdings. Marianne watched from afar as the mistress paraded around like an understudy in a dress rehearsal. Estelle approached her daughter-in-law, gripping a crystal flute of champagne. "I'm so glad you decided to cooperate tonight, Marianne." An elegant separation always begins with elegant behavior. Marianne slowly turned her head. "Separation?" Estelle offered a smile dripping with fake pity. "Oh, my dear, please don't be naive. There are things a smart woman simply realizes before they have to be spelled out for her. The most important thing now is to avoid a vulgar scandal. You have received a great deal from this family. I received status. I received protection. I received a name." Marianne let her eyes sweep the room, the custom mahogany paneling, the imported Italian marble floors, the modern art won at cutthroat auctions. She thought of her father's land, the agonizing nights calculating overhead costs, the personal guarantees she had blindly signed, the clean money that had bled out of her own family so that this house, this company, and this suffocating arrogance could even exist. "You are absolutely right about one thing, Estelle," Marianne replied softly. "There are things a smart woman realizes long before they are spelled out." Estelle's brow furrowed in confusion, but a wealthy socialite quickly pulled her away for a kiss on the cheek. Marianne continued drifting through the ballroom, accepting handshakes and returning polite smiles. Some of the older, loyal estate staff looked at her with quiet, knowing affection. One of them, Thomas, the head estate manager, approached her with total discretion. "Do you require anything at all this evening, Mrs. Vance?" She lightly touched his forearm. "Thomas, when an attorney named Claire Norton arrives at the gate, I need her escorted directly to the West Wing study. Do not notify Mr. Vance." Thomas didn't ask a single question. He had run the household for 12 years and had seen far more than he would ever speak of. He simply gave a sharp nod. At 9:00 p.m., Henry took the microphone on the small stage erected at the far end of the ballroom. He delivered a booming, charismatic speech about the future of the American skyline, the power of international partnerships, and his grueling, inspiring journey as a self-made man who had built his empire from the dirt up. Hearing that specific lie repeated out loud, Marianne felt a heavy iron door click shut inside her soul. There was no longer any burning, chaotic rage. There was only the cold mechanics of a sniper's precision. "And tonight," Henry continued, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings, "I want to personally recognize someone who has been absolutely essential to this new frontier. A brilliant, loyal, and tireless professional. Chloe Davies." The applause rolled through the room. Chloe ascended the stage, her eyes glistening with perfectly rehearsed, photogenic tears. Henry took her hand and held it for a second that lasted far too long. Paparazzi flashes exploded. The ballroom accepted the brazen intimacy with the cowardly, silent complicity that only rooms full of billionaires can muster. Everyone knew. Nobody said a word. Marianne was standing near the grand centerpiece table when she saw the necklace. The sapphires rested against Chloe's collarbone like heavy, blue drops of blood. The entire world around Marianne seemed to instantly warp and narrow. She recognized the jewelry before her brain even formed the thought. The old receipt flashed in her mind. The broken promise of their 10th anniversary. The hidden safe. The endless, suffocating lies. Maybe Henry had given the necklace to Chloe just that week. Maybe he had planned it months ago. The exact timeline didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that he had brought his mistress into her home, draped her in a piece of jewelry bought while he was cheating on her the very first time, paraded her as the future of the company in front of the world, and still had the absolute audacity to think she was the one who might ruin his evening. As Chloe stepped gracefully off the stage, Marianne began to walk directly toward her. Henry spotted the trajectory and immediately moved to intercept. But out of the corner of her eye, Marianne saw Claire Norton entering the ballroom from the side doors, flanked silently by Thomas. Marianne stopped right in front of Chloe. Her demeanor was so impossibly serene that the younger woman actually smiled, genuinely believing she had won. "That is a stunning necklace," Marianne said, her voice carrying clearly. Chloe's hand fluttered up to touch the sapphires. "Oh, it was a gift, as you can imagine." Henry always did love gifting his old, past mistakes as if they were brand new conquests. Chloe's triumphant smile instantly vanished. A few investors standing nearby stopped talking and turned their heads. Henry arrived breathless beside them. "Marianne, do not do this." She didn't even blink. She kept her eyes locked on his. "Do what, exactly?" "Do not ruin this night." "How fascinating. You brought your mistress into my home. You put a piece of jewelry around her neck that you bought while you were sleeping with another woman years ago. You presented her as the future of your empire to a room full of people, and you still honestly believe that I am the one with the power to ruin something?" The silence that crashed down over the ballroom was so absolute, so violent, that the string quartet's music suddenly sounded like a desperate intrusion. Someone frantically signaled the band to stop. Chloe turned the color of ash. Estelle pushed her way through the crowd, her face twisted in horror. "Marianne, control yourself immediately." "I have controlled myself for 15 years, Estelle. You simply confused my control with submission." Henry grabbed his wife's upper arm, his grip bruising. But she ripped her arm out of his grasp so swiftly that the gesture didn't even register as dominance. "We are going to discuss this in private," Henry hissed. "No, we are not. You lied in public. You erased my entire history in public. You humiliated me in public. So tonight, you are going to hear exactly enough in public to understand that you are finished." Claire stepped smoothly out of the shadows and placed a massive, heavily bound envelope squarely on the marble centerpiece table. Marianne unsnapped her small clutch, withdrew the sleek pen, and laid it gently beside the documents. "What the hell is this?" Henry asked, his booming voice suddenly sounding thin and hollow. "Your third mistake, translated into legal binding." He ripped open the envelope. His eyes scanned the cover page, then the second. The blood rushed out of his face so fast he looked physically ill. "Are you insane? You're not legally represented to." Claire took a deliberate step forward, projecting her voice just enough. "Mr. Vance, I am her representation. That contract outlines an immediate divorce filing, a comprehensive division of assets, the legal recognition of Marianne Atwood Vance's original corporate equity, and an emergency preservation of all holdings. Any attempt to move, hide, or liquidate assets following this verbal and written notification will be prosecuted as a federal crime." Henry spun around in a panic. The international investors were already whispering fiercely among themselves. His loyal board directors were actively averting their eyes. Chloe looked as though she wanted to rip the heavy sapphires off her neck and swallow them whole. "Half," Henry whispered, his eyes locking onto a specific clause. "You are asking for half of everything I built?" Marianne stepped into his personal space, just close enough that he could hear her without her having to shout. "No, Henry. I am taking half of everything you told the world you built alone." Estelle let out a shrill, nervous cackle. "This is completely absurd. She knows absolutely nothing about the internal structure of this company." Marianne pivoted slowly toward her mother-in-law. "I know exactly where it started. I know whose money bought the first acreage. I know exactly which board minutes were forged. I know which chief financial officer you fired for questioning your fraud. I know every single shell LLC you used to bury my equity. I know significantly more than you would ever want me to know." Henry slammed the envelope down onto the marble. "You don't have a single shred of proof." Claire answered before Marianne even drew a breath. "We have more than enough for a federal judge to freeze every account you have by 8:30 a.m. tomorrow. And we have more than enough to terrify every single investor standing in this room tonight." The heaviest blow wasn't the legal threat. It was the brutal social reality. Henry looked around and realized that the powerful men who usually laughed at his jokes and vied for his attention were now rapidly calculating their own exposure. To them, a cheating wife was cheap tabloid gossip. Corporate fraud and a locked-down balance sheet was a financial nightmare. Chloe reached out a trembling hand to touch his sleeve. "Henry, please, let's just go." Marianne looked down at the younger woman's hand. I would highly advise you to leave the premises. That necklace is about to be listed under marital assets acquired with joint funds. Unless, of course, you would like to explain under oath why you were accepting high-end jewelry from a married man while actively participating in corporate strategies to hide his assets. Chloe snatched her hand back as if Henry's suit jacket had caught fire. Henry leaned in close to Marianne, his voice vibrating with pure, unadulterated hatred. You are going to regret this. She did not flinch. She held his gaze until he blinked first. I already regretted forgiving you back when you still thought forgiveness meant permission. That night, Marianne walked out of the Hamptons estate, long before the catering staff cleared the plates. She didn't pack a single suitcase. She didn't take the artwork. She didn't take the jewelry. She simply walked out the front doors with Claire by her side, passing a row of staff members who pretended to fix floral arrangements just to hide their triumphant tears. When she slid into the back of the waiting SUV, she took her first real breath in years. The massive mansion behind her was still ablaze with light, but it no longer looked like a home. It looked like a theater set being aggressively dismantled after the final curtain call. Henry remained trapped in the ballroom, surrounded by a deafening hum of whispers. For the very first time in his life, he had absolutely no idea what speech to give. Chloe was hyperventilating in a guest bathroom. Estelle was frantically dialing family crisis lawyers. The investors were already texting their risk assessment teams, and sitting dead center on the marble table, the sleek pen remained entirely untouched beside the contract. Marianne didn't need him to sign it that night. She only needed the entire world to know that the silent wife had finally found her voice. The next morning, the East Coast woke up to the undeniable smell of blood in the water. No major newspaper had the full story yet, but Wall Street rumors moved significantly faster than official press releases. Family meltdown at Vance Investor Gala. Magnate's wife flees estate after public confrontation. Impending asset dispute threatens Manhattan real estate giant. Henry tried to violently control the narrative before the stock market even opened. He ordered his PR team to issue a sanitized statement citing deeply personal family matters being handled with mutual respect. At exactly 8:30 a.m., Claire Norton filed the first devastating injunction, legally freezing the empire's liquid assets. Respect, Henry quickly discovered, was an entirely useless word once the legal documents began doing the talking. He summoned his crisis attorneys, his accountants, and his board of directors for an emergency war room meeting. His massive executive suite overlooking Fifth Avenue was packed with sweating men flipping through binders. Henry paced the length of the room like a caged animal. She doesn't understand half of the legal jargon she's demanding. This is all that vicious bulldog lawyer whispering in her ear. One of the senior defense attorneys, a man far too expensive to feed his client fairy tales, cleared his throat. Henry, the initial discovery packet we received this morning is catastrophic. If the original Atwood capital is legally recognized as the foundational equity of your expansion, and if there is a verified paper trail of undue dilution, if there is, Henry barked, slamming his fist on the glass table. You work for me! Find a goddamn loophole! Nobody answered him with the rapid-fire obedience he was used to. It was the first time in his entire career that his fury was met with deafening silence instead of submission. Meanwhile, Marianne had quietly relocated to her late father's modest, rent-controlled apartment in Queens, which had been locked and preserved since Arthur's death. The place smelled of old pine wood and had simple, sturdy furniture. There was a small balcony that overlooked a neighborhood park. There was no imported marble, no infinity pool, and no biometric security system. Yet, Marianne slept better on that first night than she had in the Hamptons mansion in over a decade. The sheer absence of Henry Vance was a profound peace she was only just learning how to breathe. Claire arrived every single afternoon with the next phase of the legal slaughter. Vince, the accountant, built massive spreadsheets that translated Marianne's painful memories into undeniable arithmetic. Oliver Mills, the exiled CFO, agreed to provide sworn depositions on the strict condition that his family be shielded from the media fallout. Other ghosts from Henry's past began knocking on Marianne's door once the news of the gala confrontation went viral. A former executive assistant handed over a box of printed internal emails. A retired structural engineer revealed that the original Atwood land deed had been illegally leveraged as collateral for 3 separate, massive loans. An elderly bookkeeper testified to seeing Marianne's personal documents locked away in Henry's private corporate safe. Every new witness expanded the blast radius. It wasn't an isolated mistake. It wasn't sloppy bookkeeping. It was a calculated, predatory methodology. Henry reacted exactly as Claire had predicted. First, he tried to play the victim. He sent obscene amounts of white roses to the Queen's apartment, accompanied by a handwritten note. We both know this has gone way too far. Please, let's just talk. No lawyers. Marianne left the flowers rotting on the curb and handed the note directly to Claire to be filed as evidence of him attempting to bypass legal channels. Next, he tried intimidation. He sent thinly veiled threats through mutual society friends, heavily implying that he would drag her emotional stability through the mud. He threatened to leak stories claiming Marianne had always been clinically unstable and prone to delusions. Claire instantly fired back with a cease and desist, threatening a massive defamation suit if he spoke a word outside the courtroom. When both tactics failed miserably, Henry resorted to a public smear campaign. A hit piece planted in a prominent financial blog suggested that Marianne was a bitter housewife attempting a post-marriage cash grab, having spent decades completely disconnected from the brutal reality of corporate decision-making. The accompanying photo showed her leaving a charity event, looking exhausted, as if exhaustion were a crime. Marianne read the entire article while sipping her morning coffee, her hands perfectly steady. She immediately authorized Claire to release a devastatingly brief, lethal statement to the press. Mrs. Marianne Atwood Vance will discuss verifiable facts, signed contracts, and forensic evidence exclusively within a court of law. She will not engage in a battle of reputation via cowardly media leaks. The terrifying elegance of her response damaged Henry far more than a screaming tabloid cover ever could. Chloe, on the other hand, was rapidly discovering that promoted mistresses are rarely offered a golden parachute when they transform into a legal liability. Henry began sending her calls straight to voicemail. Estelle completely froze her out of the social circuit. The Vance Holdings board strongly advised the director of corporate image to take an immediate, indefinite leave of absence. Chloe, who had spent months imagining herself ascending the throne, was suddenly being treated like toxic waste by the Vance family. Desperate and panicked, she ambushed Henry at the Tribeca loft. "You promised me you were going to divorce her and claim us?" Chloe screamed. Henry, buried behind towers of legal boxes and audited financial records, barely even looked up. "Not now, Chloe. Read the damn room. I am being slaughtered out there. The New York Post is already printing my name. Your mother won't return my calls. My accounts are tied to the corporate freeze. Do you really think my biggest problem right now is my popularity?" Chloe took a step back, her pride stinging. "You better watch yourself, Henry. I know things about this company." He finally looked up, his eyes dead and shark-like. "And I know exactly who you were before I put you in that oversized leather chair. Do not confuse intimacy with actual power." In that brutal, freezing moment, Chloe finally understood the horrific truth that Marianne had spent years trying to swallow. Henry Vance didn't actually love women. He loved functions. Marianne had been his foundation. Brianna had been a distraction. Chloe was just a shiny hood ornament. And the second a function stopped serving him, he simply discarded the part. The preliminary mediation hearing took place 3 weeks later. The conference room was completely private, but the air possessed the crushing gravity of a federal courtroom. Henry walked in flanked by 4 expensive litigators. His bespoke suit was immaculate, but his face was drawn and gray. Marianne arrived with Claire and Vince. She wore a simple, tailored beige suit. No jewelry. When Henry saw her, a spike of genuine fury hit him, born entirely of her utter tranquility. He had fully expected to walk in and find a broken, hysterical woman. Instead, he found someone who had been rebuilt using titanium. The mediator opened the session by desperately pushing for a rapid settlement. Henry's lead counsel slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a massive, generous cash buyout, the deeds to 2 luxury penthouses, and the quiet right to retain the Vance last name strictly on the condition that Marianne permanently drop her claim to the corporate equity. It was a staggering amount of money to anyone looking from the outside. It was insulting to anyone who knew the truth. Claire pushed the paper back without even picking it up. "My client is not asking for emotional alimony. She is reclaiming the foundational equity built with her own capital, which was actively and fraudulently concealed through illegal shell maneuvering." Henry leaned violently over the table. "Marianne has never managed a single day in that company." Marianne spoke for the very first time. Her voice was like glass. "I managed it long before you even had the right to call it a company." Claire opened her briefcase and dropped the original Atwood land deed onto the table. Next came the forged power of attorney from the week Marianne had been hospitalized. Vince, the accountant, stood up and flawlessly walked the room through the money trail, using blown-up charts to show exactly how Marianne's original shares had been bled dry and funneled into holding companies solely controlled by Henry. Oliver Mills's sworn affidavit was presented. The room grew suffocatingly tight. One of Henry's lawyers immediately tried to dismiss Oliver as a bitter, resentful ex-employee out for revenge. Claire simply smiled, reached into her file, and slid printed copies of Henry's own internal emails across the mahogany. Among them was the exact sentence Marianne would never, ever forget. "She trusts me. Just handle it." The mediator called for an immediate recess. Out in the hallway, Henry cornered Marianne, completely ignoring Claire's warning glare. "Do you actually want to see me destroyed?" Marianne took a slow, deep breath. "I wanted to be seen while I was breaking my back helping you build. You do realize that taking half the equity is going to severely impact thousands of innocent employees, right? Do not dare use working-class people as your human shield." Marianne snapped, her voice finally cracking like a whip. "My father respected construction workers. You used their sweat to buy yachts, and now you want to use their fear to protect your wallet." Henry clenched his jaw so hard a muscle ticked. "Marianne, we can still fix this. As a family." Marianne looked at the heavy oak door of the conference room. Family does not forge the other's history. The second half of the hearing was a total bloodbath. Claire introduced subpoenaed text messages from Chloe's phone, legally acquired through a parallel investigation into the hidden assets. In one text, Chloe had written, "Before you file the divorce papers, make sure you transfer the new commercial lots to the Clean LLC. She won't even notice." In another, she had complained, "You told me this necklace had absolutely no ties to her." The jeweler's receipt was introduced as evidence. It was a symbolic detail, but legally, it was a kill shot to his public narrative. It definitively proved a continuous timeline of deceit, fraud, and the misappropriation of joint marital funds to conduct an affair. When Chloe was eventually deposed weeks later, she tried to play the naive victim. She cried on camera, claiming she didn't understand complex corporate law, that she was just repeating things Henry told her to say, and that their relationship was incredibly recent. Claire responded by dropping a stack of international flight logs, luxury hotel bookings, and romantic emails dating back a full 2 years. Chloe's mask disintegrated without a sound. She wept openly, not out of genuine remorse, Marianne could see that clearly, but purely out of the agonizing realization that she was no longer standing on the winning side. After months of grueling, brutal trench warfare, Henry finally faced the one thing he feared more than death itself. It wasn't poverty. It was the total loss of control. The judge ordered massive preventative freezes on all accounts, mandated an independent, third-party forensic audit of Vance Holdings, and forced Henry into binding arbitration under the threat of a fully public, unsealed federal trial. Wall Street panicked. Investors demanded a blood sacrifice to stabilize the stock. Megabanks began aggressively calling in their loans. Board members who used to laugh at his jokes quietly began negotiating their exit packages. The Vance empire didn't collapse overnight in a cloud of dust, but it shrieked and groaned like a skyscraper built on a cracked foundation. At the final settlement signing, Henry looked visibly aged. The hair at his temples had gone entirely silver, and his previously arrogant eyes were hollow and bloodshot. The final, binding decree legally recognized Marianne's massive equity stake in the foundational assets. It transferred prime real estate, a massive block of voting shares, and total control over specific, highly profitable developments directly into her name, alongside a staggering financial payout for the concealment damages. In practice, Marianne walked away with exactly half of the consolidated empire and the legally binding, historical admission of the truth. Henry hovered his pen over the signature line for a long time. He looked up at her. "Are you really going to do this to me?" Marianne stared down at the crisp white paper. She remembered the first gala in Manhattan, standing in the hallway. She remembered the phone lighting up with Chloe's texts in the rain. She remembered the sapphire necklace resting on the wrong woman's skin in front of the world. But above all of that, she remembered her father, with his rough, calloused hands, telling her that a building is only as strong as the concrete poured in the dark. "No, Henry, you did this. I just finally stopped signing on the bottom line." He signed. The scratching of the pen against the paper was quiet, almost entirely banal. Thunder didn't crash. The walls didn't shake. Yet, to Marianne, that tiny scratching sound was the official end of 15 years of erasure. It didn't magically refund the years of humiliation, nor did it resurrect the naive girl who honestly believed that love was enough to keep a woman safe. But it returned something far more vital, the absolute authorship of her own life. When she walked out of the towering glass building, a swarm of journalists was waiting on the steps. One shouted over the crowd, asking if she considered herself vindicated. Marianne paused for a moment, letting the cold New York wind hit her face. Revenge would be demanding what belongs to him. Justice is simply taking back what was always mine. That quote dominated the front page of the Wall Street Journal the next morning. For the very first time, the history of Henry Vance was no longer being told in his voice alone. After the ink dried, the world did not magically become simple. Marianne quickly learned that liberation requires a massive amount of exhausting bureaucracy and quiet grieving. There were deeds to transfer, legal teams to restructure, mega contracts to renegotiate, tense meetings with hostile bankers, and long conversations with terrified employees. There were also nights when she woke up in a cold sweat, missing not Henry but the man she had spent a decade pretending he was. The death of a marriage doesn't just bury the love, it buries the entire version of the future a woman spent years rehearsing in her head. Still, the mornings eventually grew brighter. Marianne legally reverted to her maiden name on all public documents. Marianne Atwood. She absorbed her awarded assets and resurrected her father's old firm, rebranding it as Atwood Community Builders. She shifted the corporate focus toward high-quality, sustainable urban housing and massive social initiatives dedicated to the blue-collar workers of the construction industry. A massive chunk of the cash settlement was funneled directly into a newly formed trust that provided full-ride college scholarships to the children of construction workers and offered pro bono legal defense funds to women trapped in complex corporate asset disputes. When Claire asked her if structuring it that way was perhaps too emotional for a ruthless business decision, Marianne just smiled. My father used to say a beautiful building doesn't excuse an ugly neighborhood. The trust was officially named the Arthur Atwood Foundation. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Marianne spoke very briefly. She didn't mention Henry. She didn't mention the cheating. She didn't utter Chloe's name. She simply stated that certain histories must be corrected, not out of vanity, but so that other people do not learn to erase themselves as a proof of their love. In the front row of the audience, Oliver Mills wept quietly into his hands. Claire, sitting right beside him, pretended to aggressively review a legal brief just to hide her own shining eyes. Henry managed to retain the remaining half of his empire, but he quickly discovered that ruling half a kingdom without an ounce of trust feels exactly like standing in ruins. His investors forced him to accept an independent oversight board. The bank strapped him with brutal lending conditions. The executives who used to blindly obey his every command now required his orders in writing, signed in triplicate. The glamorous myth of the rogue visionary who built a skyline alone had been permanently replaced by the ugly reality of a man who stole his own wife's blueprints. He was still obscenely wealthy. He still lived in a penthouse. He still had drivers, fixers, and corner offices, but he no longer walked into a room owning the very oxygen inside it. Chloe attempted to salvage her marketing career at a rival firm, but her radioactive reputation arrived long before her resume did. It wasn't just that she was the infamous mistress in the deeply hypocritical world of high finance. Sleeping with the boss was often forgivable. What made her utterly toxic was the unsealed court record proving she had actively conspired to commit corporate fraud. She was relegated to low-tier consulting gigs, lost her wealthy friends, and discovered that Estelle Vance, who had been so warm and maternal during her rise, was now actively telling Manhattan society that she had always suspected that tacky little social climber was bad news. One rainy afternoon, Chloe showed up unannounced at the Atwood Foundation headquarters. The receptionist announced her name with clear disgust. Marianne almost had security throw her out, but ultimately decided to receive her in a Spartan conference room, featuring open blinds and a plain glass table. Chloe walked in looking drastically different. There was no crimson dress, no stolen sapphires, none of the blinding arrogance of an early victory. She looked small, or perhaps she just looked lost without a billionaire stage to stand on. I wanted to apologize, Chloe said, her voice shaking. Marianne studied her in absolute silence. For what, exactly? The blunt question derailed Chloe's rehearsed speech. She clutched her handbag with white knuckles. For everything, for sleeping with Henry, for coming into your house, for the necklace. Are you apologizing because you feel genuine remorse for destroying my life? Or are you apologizing because you lost? Chloe dropped her gaze to the floor. When the honesty finally crawled out of her throat, it was entirely devoid of glamour. At first, I truly thought you were just a lazy, complacent housewife. He told me you didn't understand his genius, that you anchored him to a boring past. I believed it because it made me feel special. Later, I realized that if he could lie to you that easily while stealing your money, he would eventually do the exact same thing to me. But by then, I was too deep in. Marianne felt no rush of vindictive pleasure. For months, she had fantasized that seeing Chloe humiliated and broken would bring her immense satisfaction. It didn't. It brought nothing but the profoundly sad confirmation that insecure women will fiercely fight each other for the best cell in a prison built by a vain man. I cannot grant you absolution, Marianne said evenly. That is work you have to do on your own. But I am also not going to carry around enough hatred to keep you relevant in my life. Chloe cried silently. Before she turned to leave, she reached into her bag and placed a small, worn velvet box on the glass table. The necklace. I didn't keep it. I know it's technically held in escrow by the courts, but I had my lawyer draft a formal surrender of all claims to the piece. I thought you should know. Thank you. When Chloe walked out, Marianne stood by the window for a long time. She realized that, for her, forgiveness was no longer an unlocked door waiting for someone to walk back in and hurt her. It was the key she used from the inside to walk out of a room she refused to live in anymore. Estelle Vance showed up weeks later, completely uninvited, in the lobby of Atwood Community Builders. She was dripping in pearls, carrying a Birkin bag, her legendary pride visibly in tatters. Marianne received her purely out of professional courtesy, entirely stripped of affection. Henry is facing severe blowback from the Oversight Committee, Estelle began, skipping the pleasantries. Some of the activist investors are aggressively trying to force him out as CEO. You still hold massive voting influence over several legacy board members. Marianne laced her fingers together on her desk. Did you come here to ask for my help, Estelle? The older woman's jaw tightened. I came to appeal to your common sense. Despite everything that happened, you were a part of this family. I was, especially when my signature was useful. The matriarch looked away. For the very first time, Marianne didn't see a terrifying grand villain. She just saw a terrified mother who had explicitly raised her son to believe that love was a transaction and women were merely stepping stones. It didn't make Estelle innocent, but it explained the exact recipe of the poison. I misspoke on several occasions, Estelle admitted, the words sounding as if they were physically burning her throat. On several. Yes, many. Marianne let the silence stretch until it was agonizing. Estelle took a ragged breath. I didn't know the exact details of the fraud Henry committed against you, but I enjoyed the lifestyle it provided. That sentence was delivered without an ounce of malice, and perhaps that was why it was so horrifying. Estelle didn't say anything else. I am not going to sabotage innocent employees just to spite Henry, Marianne said coldly. If there are board votes that protect the workers' pensions and legitimate urban projects, my proxies will vote with fiduciary responsibility. But I will absolutely not lift a single finger to save his ego, nor will I hand him back the crown he lost due to his own greed. Estelle stood up slowly. At the door, she paused and looked back. You have changed, Marianne. Marianne offered a faint, razor-sharp smile. No, Estelle, I just stopped shrinking. Henry only sought her out directly one final time, nearly a year after the ink on the divorce was dry. He waited for her near the valet stand after an Atwood Foundation charity gala, making sure there were no cameras around. He looked far less immaculate than he used to, but perhaps a bit more human. Marianne felt the old, familiar tightening in her chest, not a spark of desire, but the stubborn muscle memory of a decade of devotion. I read about the new housing project in Brooklyn, he said quietly, his hands shoved deep into his overcoat pockets. It's a masterpiece, Marianne. Thank you. He looked down at the pavement. Sometimes I lie awake and think, if I had just publicly given you the credit for the initial capital from the very beginning, none of this nightmare would have happened. Marianne looked at him with terrifying clarity. The betrayal still would have happened, Henry. He closed his eyes for a long second. I was a coward. She didn't reply. Some confessions arrive far too late to alter the course of destiny, serving only to put a name tag on a corpse. Do you ever forgive me? He asked, his voice cracking. Marianne thought of the very first time, standing in the shadows of the hotel hallway. She thought of the second time, staring at the glowing phone screen while the rain hammered the Hamptons estate. She thought of the third time, staring at the sapphire necklace under the Italian chandeliers. She thought of the desperate woman who used to forgive him just to keep the roof from caving in, even as the walls were crushing her to death. I forgive you exactly enough to not actively wish for your destruction, she said softly, but I will never forgive you enough to let you back in. Henry nodded slowly, as if the reality was finally, truly sinking into his bones. Forgiveness was not a bridge he was entitled to cross. It was a boundary line. They parted ways without a hug, without a handshake. Marianne got into her car and did not look in the rearview mirror. Through the tinted window, she watched the glittering Manhattan skyline roll by a city packed with cranes, scaffolding, and endless transformation. For years, she had genuinely believed her sole purpose in life was to safely anchor a great man's construction. Now, she finally understood that she was the master architect of herself. 1 year later, Atwood Community Builders officially cut the ribbon on its flagship residential complex. It featured a community library, a subsidized daycare, and a vocational training center for the trades. Bolted to the brick wall near the grand entrance, right beneath Arthur Atwood's name, was a bronze plaque bearing a quote chosen specifically by Marianne. No true foundation should ever be hidden. On the morning of the grand opening, a prominent journalist pulled her aside and asked if she ever regretted forgiving Henry Vance those first 2 times. Marianne took a moment before answering. The crisp autumn sun was reflecting off the clean concrete of the new towers. Children were already running through the central courtyard. Union carpenters were shaking hands with old friends. Claire Norton was standing near the podium, laughing with the new tenants. Life, entirely stripped of the suffocating weight of the Vance Empire, felt infinitely less glamorous, and impossibly, beautifully hers. "I do not regret the woman I used to be," Marianne said, looking at the skyline. She did the absolute best she could with the pain she was given. But I am eternally grateful to the woman who, on the 3rd time, finally understood that forgiving someone does not require you to stay. The journalist smiled. "Was taking half of his empire your greatest victory?" Marianne smiled back. It was not a smile of vengeance, but of arrival. No. The greatest victory was discovering that half of an empire was still incredibly small compared to getting my whole name back. That night, when she returned to her father's quiet Queen's apartment, Marianne opened the heavy lockbox. Arthur's handwritten letters were still there, resting peacefully next to the jeweler's receipt, the notarized divorce decree, and glossy photographs of the new Atwood Foundation. She no longer kept those papers like a victim hoarding open wounds. She kept them like a cartographer keeps a map. Every single page documented the agonizing path between the woman who accepted crumbs of respect and the woman who learned how to stand up without asking for permission. Before getting into bed, she left the balcony door slightly ajar. The massive city hummed with its usual noise-honking cabs, distant sirens, the heavy thud of a night shift construction crew pouring concrete blocks a few avenues over. Marianne listened to the rhythmic pounding of the jackhammers and smiled into the dark. True construction was always like this. It was loud, chaotic, exhausting, and covered in dust. But when the foundation was poured with honest hands, it could withstand absolutely any storm. She had forgiven once out of blind love. She had forgiven twice out of the terrifying fear of losing the only life she knew. On the 3rd time, she finally chose the truth. And in the end, the truth chose to stay right by her side.